A single dance changed the course of history. In the shadows of a palace, amid the tinkling of jewels and the sweet aroma of expensive perfumes, a young woman prepared to enter the hall. She didn't know that her steps that night would echo through the centuries. Her name was Salome, a princess whose hands had never been stained with blood, but who would soon hold the fate of one of history's greatest prophets. What drives a young woman of noble birth to ask for the head of a holy man as a reward for her dance? Why did John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, and one of the most respected men in Judea, need to be silenced with such urgency? And even more intriguing, what happened to Salome after that fateful night? Salome's story is rarely told in full. We know about the banquet, the seductive dance, the macabre request, but what came before and what happened after? Did the young woman who became a symbol of deadly seduction meet a fate worthy of her actions? This story offers a perspective on power and manipulation that few know about. Behind the silk curtain of Herod's palace, a dangerous game was unfolding, and at the center of this game, a young woman would become the key piece in one of the most infamous assassinations in Scripture. Who was Salome, truly? A young woman manipulated by her ambitious mother, or a calculating princess who knew exactly what she was doing, and what might have been her final destiny, after holding in her hands the head of a man whom many considered a prophet sent by God. The story takes place in 1st century Galilee, a territory under the dominion of the Roman Empire, but locally governed by Herod Antipas. To understand the setting, imagine a land of extreme contrasts. On one side, the ostentatious luxury of royal palaces. On the other, simple villages where prophets like John the Baptist preached to the multitudes. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, ruled as Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. His kingdom was a delicate political arrangement. Although he had authority over his region, he was accountable to Rome. Imagine the constant pressure of a regional ruler who needs to please both his superiors and maintain control of his territory. Herod's palace in Tiberias, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, was a monument to power and Greek influence. Polished marble floors reflected the light from hundreds of oil lamps. The scent of incense filled the corridors. Silent servants moved like shadows, attending to the wishes of the court. In the midst of this opulent environment lived Salome, young, beautiful, and privileged, daughter of Herodias and stepdaughter of Herod Antipas. Her life was different from most women of the time. While most Jewish girls worked hard at domestic tasks, Salome grew up among jewels, imported perfumes, and fine clothes. But palace life wasn't just luxury. It was also a minefield of political intrigue. Each smile could hide a betrayal. Each compliment could be the prelude to a coup. In this environment, Salome learned from an early age the art of courtly survival. The relationship between Herod Antipas and Herodias, Salome's mother, was especially scandalous by the standards of the time. Herodias had abandoned her first husband, Philip, to marry Herod Antipas, Philip's brother. This union was considered illegal under Jewish law. It was precisely this union that attracted John the Baptist's public criticism. Imagine the scene: a man dressed in camel skins, feeding on wild honey and locusts, pointing his finger at the royal palace and denouncing the ruler's immorality. The audacity was unprecedented. John the Baptist wasn't just any critic. Many considered him the greatest prophet of his generation. Crowds crossed the desert to hear him preach and be baptized in the Jordan River. His influence grew each day as he announced the coming of the Messiah. Some even wondered if John himself might be the promised savior. For Herodias, John the Baptist's denunciations weren't merely a religious inconvenience. They were a real political threat. Each word from the prophet undermined her position as queen. Each sermon jeopardized the fragile balance of power she had fought so hard to establish. This was the complex backdrop against which Salome grew up, between the luxury of the palace and the political tensions that could at any moment destroy her family. Salome grew up watching her mother, Herodias, use every available resource to maintain and expand her power. Beauty was a weapon. Intelligence, Another, and family loyalty, perhaps the most important of all. From a young age, the princess learned that the world of men could be manipulated by a skillful woman. The relationship between Herodias and Herod Antipas was flavored by passion and mutual interests. He gained a beautiful and cunning wife, she the title of queen. But there was a permanent shadow over this union. John the Baptist's voice echoing through the streets, calling her an adulteress and him a usurper. Tension in the palace grew with each of the prophet's sermons. Herod, despite being troubled by the criticism, hesitated to silence John. The tetrarch feared a popular uprising. More than that, he felt a strange fascination with the man from the desert. Biblical accounts mention that Herod feared John, knowing he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him in custody, did many things as he heard him, and heard him gladly. This hesitation infuriated Herodias. Day after day she pressured her husband to execute the prophet, and day after day she met the same resistance. It was in this climate of growing frustration that Herodias began to devise a more elaborate plan, a plan that would involve her daughter Salome. Salome, now a young woman, had been trained in the arts of dance since childhood, not the simple dance of popular celebrations, but the refined dance that entertained nobility. Her movements were precise, graceful, and when necessary, seductive. It was a rare talent, valued in the Eastern courts. The perfect opportunity arose with the celebration of Herod's birthday. The event would gather all the important men of Galilee, military officers, political leaders, great landowners. It would be a night of excess wine, abundant food, and carefully planned entertainment. The feast began like so many others in the palace. Servants moved among the guests with silver trays overflowing with exotic foods. Wine flowed generously. Conversations gradually became louder and less formal. It was at this moment that Herodias called Salome to a secluded corner of the palace. Mother and daughter talked at length. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but the result of that conversation would forever change the course of history. When Salome entered the banquet hall, a gradual silence spread across the room. The young princess, dressed in fine fabrics and adorned with sparkling jewels, positioned herself in the center of the hall. The music began, soft at first, then more intense. Salome's dance wasn't vulgar, as it has so often been portrayed in later artwork. It was a performance of impressive technical precision, combined with a natural grace that few possessed. Each movement told a story. Each gesture captured the imagination of those present. Herod, already intoxicated by wine and celebration, watched in fascination. The beauty of his stepdaughter, the perfection of her movements, the pride of showing off such talent in his court. All of this filled him with euphoric satisfaction. It was in this state of ecstasy that he committed his fatal error. Rising from his seat, Herod made an unthinking promise. "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you, up to half of my kingdom." The hall fell into absolute silence. Such a promise, made in public, was legally binding. All those present were witnesses. To back down would be an unforgivable dishonor for a ruler. Salome, showing no surprise at the offer, asked for a moment to consult her mother. It was a brief interval, but loaded with tension. When she returned, her request shocked everyone. "I want you to give me right now on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Herod's face turned pale. Of all possible requests, lands, jewels, titles, advantageous marriages, she had chosen the only one he truly hesitated to grant. John the Baptist, despite his uncomfortable criticisms, was respected by the people and by Herod himself, but the word of a king, given in public, could not be withdrawn, especially in front of the military and political leaders of the region. Showing weakness or indecision could cost him his throne. With a heavy gesture, Herod ordered the execution. Guards were sent to the prison where John was confined. The sword fell upon the neck of the prophet, who had announced the coming of Jesus. Moments later, a soldier returned to the banquet hall. In his hands a silver platter, upon it the head of John the Baptist, eyes open staring into emptiness, fresh blood still staining the polished metal. The hall, previously animated with music and conversation, fell into a sepulchral silence. Even the most hardened warriors seemed uncomfortable with the scene. The head of a holy man, as a reward for a dance, seemed excessive, even by the violent standards of the time. Salome received the platter without showing any visible emotion. With firm steps, she carried the macabre trophy to her mother. Herodias finally had her revenge against the man who had dared to challenge her position and legitimacy. Throughout the night, rumors about what had happened began to spread beyond the palace walls. John the Baptist's followers, in mourning, asked permission to give a dignified burial to their teacher's body. The request was granted, a belated gesture of respect that would not erase the horror of what had occurred. News of the execution soon reached Jesus, John's cousin and the one who had been baptized by him at the beginning of his ministry. The Gospels record that upon learning of John's death, Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. A moment of private mourning for the man whom John had announced as the Messiah. For Salome, that night marked a transformation. From young princess to instrument of a political execution, her name would forever be associated with that moment, that platter, that head. The days that followed in the palace were tense. Herod, tormented by his decision, became more irritable and suspicious. Herodias, although satisfied with the elimination of her most vocal critic, perceived that public opinion was turning against the royal family. Salome, for her part, began to experience the weight of her role in that execution. The servants avoided her gaze. The guards whispered when she passed. Even in court, there was a new discomfort in her presence. The end of John the Baptist's life is widely known, but Salome's fate remains a mystery to many. The biblical scriptures, so detailed about the prophet's execution, are silent about what happened afterward to the young dancer. To learn her destiny, we need to turn to other historical sources. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing at the end of the 1st century, offers valuable information about Herod's family. In his works Jewish Antiquities, he mentions that Salome married twice, first to her uncle Philip, the tetrarch of the region of Ituraea and Trachonitis, not to be confused with Philip, Herodias' first husband. After his death, she married Aristobulus, her cousin, son of Herod of Chalcis. These arranged marriages were typical of the time, especially among royal families seeking to consolidate political alliances. For Salome, they represented a continuation of her privileged life, despite the growing political instability in the region. What few people know is that Herod Antipas's reign began to crumble a few years after John the Baptist's execution. Many in the Jewish population interpreted the subsequent political and military setbacks as divine punishment for the prophet's murder. The biggest crisis came when Herod Antipas entered into conflict with Aretas IV, king of Nabatea. This was the father of his first wife, whom Herod had abandoned to marry Herodias. The military defeat by Aretas was devastating. Josephus explicitly connects this defeat to John's execution, but to some of the Jews, it seemed that Herod's army had been destroyed by God, who very justly avenged John, called the Baptist. The situation worsened when Herod Antipas, instigated by the ambitious Herodias, petitioned Emperor Caligula for the title of king. This political move backfired on them. Accused of conspiracy against Rome, Herod was exiled to Gaul, modern-day France, in 39 AD, approximately 10 years after John the Baptist's death. What happened to Herodias and Salome after the exile? Here historical sources diverge. Some accounts suggest that Herodias voluntarily accompanied her husband into exile, in a rare gesture of loyalty. Salome, already married during this period, remained in Judea. A fascinating detail about Salome's fate comes from an unexpected source: Christian writings from the 2nd century, primarily apocryphal texts, narrate a peculiar death for the dancer. According to this tradition, Salome supposedly died beheaded by ice plates while crossing a frozen river that gave way beneath her feet. Her head would have separated from her body, in a strange symmetry with the fate she imposed on John the Baptist. This narrative, although probably legendary, reveals something important about how the early Christian communities interpreted the story as an example of poetic divine justice. Another surprising revelation comes from modern archaeological studies. Coins minted during the brief reign of Aristobulus, Salome's second husband, were found with the effigy of a woman identified as Salome, Queen. This suggests that despite her controversial role in John the Baptist's death, Salome eventually achieved the political status her mother so desired. The palace where the famous banquet took place has been excavated by archaeologists on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The luxurious mosaics and bath systems discovered confirm the biblical account of the opulence of Herod's court. Even more surprising is the discovery, in 2012, of coins dated precisely from the period of Herod Antipas's reign. These coins display symbols considered pagan by the Orthodox Jews of the time, illustrating the cultural and religious tension that formed the backdrop of John the Baptist and Salome's story. A rarely discussed aspect is the impact of John the Baptist's death on Jesus' ministry. The Gospels indicate that it was after John's death that Jesus intensified his preaching and began to speak more openly about his messianic role. In a way, Salome's act didn't silence the message that Herodias wanted to suppress. It only transferred it to an even more powerful messenger. Excavations at the palace of Macabre, where John was probably executed, revealed a room that corresponds to the description of the banquet hall mentioned in the Gospels. In this same location, archaeologists discovered evidence of an underground prison pit, possibly the place where John spent his final days. A frequently overlooked historical detail is that Salome's dance wasn't unusual for royal feasts of the Herodian period. What was scandalous was the request for John's head, not the dance itself. In the culture of the time, women of high position generally did not perform in public, but exceptions were made for family celebrations. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark, written some decades after the event, present small differences in their accounts. Matthew suggests that Salome was completely instructed by her mother, while Mark leaves room to interpret that the young woman had some initiative of her own when consulting Herodias about what to request. Paintings and sculptures depicting Salome became extremely popular during the European Renaissance. However, most of these works portray Salome as an older, seductive woman, contradicting historical evidence suggesting she was probably a teenager at the time of the events. The last reliable historical mention of Salome dates to approximately 63 AD. After this, her name disappears from the records. If the tradition about her death by beheading on ice is true, this would probably have occurred during this period. To discover more fascinating stories like this, simply subscribe to the channel and explore the complex and frequently surprising narratives that form the fabric of the sacred scriptures. Salome's story continues to fascinate people throughout the world, thousands of years after that fateful night in Herod's palace. Why? Because it touches on themes that transcend time and culture: power, manipulation, desire, and the unforeseen consequences of our actions. Looking beyond the moment of the dance and the macabre request, we see a young woman navigating a world dominated by power games. Salome didn't choose to be born into the Herodian family. She didn't choose to have Herodias as a mother, but the choices she made in the face of circumstances defined her place in history. How many times do we also find ourselves caught between conflicting loyalties,
between what we know is right and what those we love expect from us. Salome chose family loyalty above moral or ethical considerations, and she paid the price, perhaps not immediately, but throughout a life marked by association with one of history's most infamous murders. The contrast between John the Baptist and Salome couldn't be greater. One lived in the austerity of the desert, speaking uncomfortable truths regardless of the consequences. The other lived in the luxury of the palace, using her beauty and talent to navigate a corrupt system. And yet their destinies became inextricably intertwined that night. John the Baptist died, but his message continued through Jesus and his followers. Herod's kingdom crumbled in less than a decade. Herodias lost everything she had gained through manipulation and ambition. And Salome, she moved forward, married, possibly even reigned briefly, but never escaped the shadow of that silver platter. There's a profound lesson here about true power. John, in his poverty and simplicity, left a legacy that continues to inspire billions of people. Salome, despite all her wealth and privilege, is remembered primarily for her role in silencing a good man. The historical and archaeological evidence we've discovered in recent decades confirms the essence of the biblical account: the luxury of the palace, the political instability, the religious tension, and at the center of it all, real people making choices with real consequences. The question we asked at the beginning, who was Salome truly, remains partially a mystery. Historical sources give us fragments, not the complete picture. Was she a young woman manipulated by an ambitious mother, a calculating princess, or simply an ordinary person caught in extraordinary circumstances? Perhaps the closest we can come to the truth is to recognize the human complexity present in each character of this story. Herod divided between admiration for John and fear of appearing weak. Herodias, determined to eliminate any threat to her hard-won status. And Salome, navigating the dangerous currents of palace politics in the only way she knew how. Salome's final fate, whether death by beheading on ice as tradition suggests, or simply the gradual disappearance from historical records, carries a strange poetic symmetry. She who asked for the head of a holy man may have met an end that echoes her most famous crime, but beyond Salome's possible physical fate lies her legacy. Her name became synonymous with fatal seduction, with beauty used as a weapon. In literature, painting, music, and film, she continues to be reinvented, not always with historical accuracy, but always as a powerful symbol. The true tragedy of Salome's story isn't just John the Baptist's death, it's also the waste of human potential. A young woman who could have used her privileged position for any purpose, chose to be an instrument of vengeance and death. And perhaps therein lies the most universal lesson of this ancient story. Our moments of choice define who we are. The circumstances of our birth or the pressures we face don't matter. In the end, we are remembered for the choices we make when confronting the crossroads between convenience and principle, between blind loyalty and uncomfortable truth. Salome's dance ended long ago, the echo of her steps silenced on the palace stones, but the waves of consequence from that night continue to reverberate through the centuries, reminding us that even our most private acts can have repercussions far beyond what we could ever imagine.